what I thought I'd do to start with, as people are joining, is give a very quick overview of the relationship between HSE and WECK. WECK is the Workplace Health Expert Committee. It was set up a number of years ago now, and I know that Emma and Paul are going to say a little bit more about that, so I won't spoil the story too much. But I just wanted to make the point that it's a very important scientific advisory committee for the Health and Safety Executive. It provides us with the opportunity to seek expert advice on new and emerging occupational health risks, and also to see if old risks are emerging in new sectors. So we are always seeking the advice from WECK to provide us with a good, strong evidence base for areas of new and emerging concern. The question of work-related suicide came in, and WECK were very keen to make sure that they were looking at all of the evidence in this space. So what we're going to hear about today from Emma and Paul is a summary of that work, and then obviously there'll be the opportunity to ask questions at the end. One of the great things about WECK is that the membership is fantastic. We have a very broad range of skills available on the committee to consider all different kinds of aspects of occupational health risks. And today I'm really pleased that two WECK members will be presenting. The first is Dr. Emma Donaldson-Fielder. Emma is a registered occupational psychologist and a chartered coaching psychologist, and her varied professional portfolio includes a wide range of activities, which includes coaching senior managers, individual and group supervision for coaches, consultancy activities, teaching relational mindfulness, research, writing, speaking, and working on public policy. Emma aims to support the development of kinder, wiser workplaces with a particular focus on the role of positive relational leadership and line management in improving employee health and well-being. And Emma has been a member of WECK since it was created in 2015. And then we're also joined by Dr. Paul Litchfield. Paul is a specialist in occupational medicine and corporate medical advisor, and is currently independent chief medical advisor to ITV and Compass Group. Previously, he was chief medical officer at BT, and throughout that career, he's promoted better mental health and well-being in the workplace for many, many years. As a consequence of that, has worked with multiple international organisations to advance that important agenda. Paul was the founding chair of the UK's What Works Centre for Wellbeing and is co-chair of the National Forum for Health and Wellbeing in the Workplace. And he's been a member of WECK since 2018. So if I can have the next slide, please, Emma. Thank you very much. Just to reinforce the message about the questions, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Mentimeter app, which you can access via the QR code on screen now or through Eventbrite, or you can email your questions to the email address on the screen if that particular Mentimeter system doesn't work for you. So without further ado, it's my enormous pleasure to invite Emma to start today's seminar. Emma, thank you very much.
So Emma hasn't suddenly developed a sore throat, Andrew, but
apologies, Paul.
I will kick off if that's okay. So what we'll aim to do, Emma and I will aim to do over the next 30 minutes or so, is talk a bit about, as Andrew has said, the Workplace Health Expert Committee, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we'll tend to say WECK. Then go into what I suspect you've really joined to hear, which is the findings from the literature review that the committee carried out on work-related suicide, focusing on three main elements. So first off, the incidence of suicide and the associations between that risk and occupation in the UK. Secondly, to talk about some models that aim to explain suicide risks. And then thirdly, the evidence for occupational factors that might contribute to that risk of suicide. And then we'll round off by pulling together the conclusions that we put together as a committee. So if we can have the next slide, please, Emma. And the one after that. Right, so as Andrew has said, the purpose of WECK is to consider the evidence linking workplace hazards to ill health. And as he said, the committee's been up and running for about 7 years now, and provides independent, and I stress that word independent, advice to HSE on new and emerging workplace health issues, new and emerging evidence relating to existing workplace health issues, and also, thirdly, the quality and relevance of the evidence base on workplace health issues. So if we can move on, please, Emma. So the membership, the committee has been chaired since its outset by Professor Satone Newman-Taylor, and the we members come from a diverse range of backgrounds. So there are occupational physicians, ergonomists, occupational hygienists, epidemiologists, occupational psychologists. If I've missed any discipline, please excuse me. And you can see the current members on the slide there. As Andrew said, I am a relatively late joiner to the committee, having joined in 2018 with Joanna Wild, but others have been there since the outset, and previous members have been the late Chingor and Keith Palmer. The secretariat for the group is provided by the HSE, and Andrew and some of his colleagues attend meetings, and that gives a good interface for us with the HSE. So if we can move on, Emma. So we've produced a number of publications over the years, and those fall into two categories. Some are position papers, which we've highlighted in blue, but the majority have been evidence reviews. And as you can see, if you scan the lists there, it covers quite a wide range of topics going across physical and mental hazards in the workplace. And all of those reports are available on the HSE website, and the link is shown there towards the top right of the slide. The important disclaimer is at the bottom in the red box. So the reports that we write are independent of HSE. The contents of those reports, therefore, including any opinions or conclusions that we have expressed, are those of the authors, that is us as a committee alone, and don't necessarily reflect HSE policy. We hope that HSE takes account of what we say, but we certainly don't purport to represent HSE in any sort of official capacity. So if we can move on, please, Emma. So the meat of what you've joined to hear is, of course, the literature review itself and our findings in looking at work-related suicide. Now, the first thing to say is that this gets a bit complicated when you start to look at it, and not least because looking at the incidence of suicide, there are two standard measures that one looks at. So there's standardized mortality rate, which is looking at the rate of suicide in a given occupational group and then comparing that to the general population. And to do that, you need access to at least two data sources. So you're combining things from different areas. And for example, occupational rates tend to only come out every 10 years or so, generally with the census. So you're looking at things not necessarily over the same period of time too. So standardized mortality rate is very useful because the data is standardized. So it takes accounts of things like differing age and gender mixes in occupational groups, but it's quite complicated to produce. The other way of looking at things is the proportional mortality rate, and that's where you look at essentially what proportion of the people that die in any occupational group are related to suicide, and then you can compare that with other groups. So it's simpler to do, but of course the data isn't standardized. So if, for example, you're looking at groups where there is a significant gender or age differential, then you might get quite misleading results. So having expressed that caveat, if you like, which we tried to explain in the report, because I think it's important to say before you move on, there is no doubt that suicide is an important cause of premature death. If one looks globally, we're looking at around about 800,000 suicides per year. And in this country, around about 6,500. Now, the data we've used in the report is from just before the pandemic. The most recent data for 2021 came out a few weeks ago and shows that the headline rate of suicides is around about what it was just before the pandemic. So it holds good. And what has also held good is that consistently around about 3/4 of the people who take their own lives are men, so the rate there is significantly higher, and that rate is also higher in people of middle age. So the 40 to 54 age group has been the highest age group for some years now. Also, for the 2018 data, those over the age of 80 were significantly higher. What has changed a bit in the last 3 years is that the number of suicides in that older age group has come down a bit and come back down more to what it was, say, 5 or 6 years ago. But certainly when you look at the working age population, suicide rates are higher in that group than they are among either the very young or the very old. So there are also, though, differences within the UK. And when we look at geographical differences, what we see is that Scotland has the highest rates, then Wales, then England. And within England, the highest rates are in the northeast and Yorkshire and the Humber district, whereas London and the southeast have the lowest suicide rates. Now, those geographical differences within the UK, within Great Britain, can only be made for men because the numbers are too small in women to make any meaningful comparisons. But there's certainly a gradient geographically within the UK. If we can move on, Emma. So we then move on to suicide risk and occupation, which is where it starts to get a bit complicated. So there is no doubt that there are well-established variations by occupation. And when one looks at the data, particularly the SMRs, then you see that people in the lower socioeconomic groups, people in low-skilled or lower-skilled, semi-skilled occupations have a significantly higher rate than those in other occupations or the general population. Now, when we look then at specific occupations, there do appear to be higher rates in some of those too. And in particular, we see it in construction, trades, in care workers, and in some people working in the creative industries and hospitality. But it does get complicated because a lot of that is based on proportional mortality rates, as I spoke about a few minutes ago, but also when you look at that ranking, it shifts over time. So if we compare the occupations with the highest rates now with those of a generation ago, then the top 5, if you like, or the top 10 are really quite different to what they were some years ago. So things do shift over time. And what that means is that when we start to dig into what is it within a job, what is it within work that might be a driver of suicide, it starts to get really quite complex, and it's also dynamic. There's lots of interaction between different factors. Now, if I've learned one thing over the last 40 years of working in occupational medicine, it's that when things start to get complex, hand over to somebody else. And ideally somebody who knows what they're talking about. And Emma Donaldson-Fielder clearly meets those criteria. So Emma, over to you for the difficult stuff.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I can. Oh dear, I'm getting some feedback. Good, I think that stopped. Sorry for that. Thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. I'm not sure if I can rise to that, but let's do my best. And really drawing on other people's research here, not my own. So with that sort of complex picture in mind, taking a step back and looking at how do we explain suicide risk at all? Suicide is not one of those diseases where we've got a clear-cut pathological mechanism that we can draw upon to help us look at how do we prevent and manage the risk. Instead, suicide has this kind of complex, that Paul's already touched upon, this complex interaction of different factors that's dynamic, changing over time. And it's a combination of the sort of socioeconomic and environmental factors, behavioural factors for the individual, psychiatric factors, and all the predisposing mechanisms seem to be very multifaceted. And they would include things from the society that people are in, the cultural background, and the individual factors. And all of that, as we've already pointed to, is changing over time. So there have been quite a few different models that have aimed to explain suicide risk, and they've come at this from a number of different directions, from a sort of sociological direction, from a psychological direction, from a behavioural direction, looking at population health. So there's been a wide range of different models. And in recent years, that's led to a call for a much more comprehensive and unified approach, rather than coming at it from a single discipline. So that links nicely with WECK and its very multidisciplinary approach. But the model that seems to be particularly helpful in this context that we've drawn upon in our paper is Rory O'Connor's model. So Rory O'Connor, who's based at Glasgow University, and his colleagues have created this model which they call the integrated motivational volitional model. And they've done that by drawing together evidence and research to identify as many as possible of the potential factors that might lead to a death by suicide. And they've divided these into kind of three phases, which might be chronological or build upon one another. So the first phase, the pre-motivational phase, is about the background factors and any triggering life events. So it's the environment, if you like, in which the person is operating, and in the case of our interest, it is working. So this might be diathesis, it might be the kind of inbuilt factors within the individual, it might be the environment, and it might be life events. And so if you think of this from an occupational or work-related context, it's possible that the work environment might contribute to this pre-motivational phase. Things like if it's a very insecure work environment where job loss is always a risk. It might also contribute life events. A particular event in the workplace might be part of this kind of pre-motivational triggering phase. The second phase is what they've called the motivational phase, and this is where, building on those factors, there's kind of a process that people go through to reach a point where they are actually thinking about and potentially intending to undertake suicidal behaviour. And they've grouped this into kind of defeat and humiliation, a sense of being rejected perhaps, or being humiliated, and that might happen in the workplace. Moving to then a sense of being trapped and thinking that there's perhaps no other way out, that then might lead to suicidal ideation and intent. And they've identified a number of different moderators that might determine whether this pathway is actually pursued. And again, I think the workplace might contribute to these moderators. So, for example, if the workplace is particularly influential in terms of, for example, thwarting belongingness, that might lead somebody from feeling trapped to feeling that they are considering suicide. But it also might provide a sense of belonging. So it could work in both directions. Similarly, with problem solving and coping, it may be that the workplace is very down on that, or it may be that the workplace actually supports people to problem solve and to cope well. So that motivational phase might just lead to suicidal ideation, but it won't actually tip into a death by suicide until you move into the third phase, which is the volitional phase, which is where you actually get into suicidal behavior. And here, the key step is whether there are these volitional moderators in place. And again, the workplace might or might not contribute to those. So to unpack the list that O'Connor and his colleagues identify of these moderators, as you can see there on the screen, there's quite a few different moderators here that might tip somebody from thinking about suicide to actually engaging in suicidal behaviour. And I think the key ones that are relevant in a workplace context or an occupational context are access to means right at the top here. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but thinking about, does an individual through their work have ready access to a means of suicide? The other one that might happen or might occur through the workplace is about exposure to suicide or suicidal behaviour. And that might be a colleague, or it might be, for example, a service user or others that people come into contact with through their work. The others are perhaps less likely to be linked to work, but that might possibly be. So what we did in our literature review was look at the factors that might actually occur through occupation and that might explain some of the variations that Paul was talking about earlier. And the group of factors that seem to be the most consistently coming through in the evidence is around unemployment and low pay. And there seems to be some fairly clear data that those who are unemployed and those who are permanently unable to work due to ill health do have an increased risk of suicide. So not being in employment is problematic. And also there's some evidence that community rates of poverty and deprivation could be related to suicide, but that depends a bit on the person's history and whether they have a history of mental illness or not. Looking then at the actual job conditions, if you like, particularly the psychosocial stressors within a particular person's job, there's a growing body of evidence around this, and Paul mentioned some papers that have come out since we did our review. But the evidence for association with specific job stressors is a little limited. It's beginning to grow, and I think it's fair to say that job control, lack of job control, seems to be fairly consistently coming through as being problematic. What's interesting and makes the research perhaps more complex to conduct is that there's some indication that this might be a curvilinear relationship. So it might be U-shaped. So those who have a very low level of stress, perhaps because they are not being actually having a sense of purpose at all, not really doing very much, and those who have an extremely high level of work stress appear to be at greater risk of suicide, whereas those with a kind of more moderate level of work stress are less at risk. Then looking at some other job factors, social isolation is well established in the literature as being a risk factor for suicide. Now, this hasn't actually been looked at particularly by occupation, but it might explain why some of the jobs that seem to be at high suicide risk do present that risk, because they are more isolated. There's also some growing evidence around bullying, that people who who experience bullying in the workplace are more likely to at least think about suicide, consider suicide. The link to actual suicide behaviour is still quite limited in terms of evidence. And there's also a bit of data around exposure to toxins and dangerous chemicals, and also to being injured in the workplace, that might increase risk. The other factors that came through in our literature review were, first of all, as I said earlier, this factor around access to means. So occupations where people have access to and are familiar with particular methods of suicide, there does seem to be a higher risk. So, for example, vets, pharmacists and medical practitioners, particularly if you think about anaesthetics, vets who have chemicals used for euthanasia, farmers in terms of firearms seem to potentially be at higher risk as well. So there's something here about how the work might be an actual step in terms of being able, when you think about suicide, to actually then engage in suicide behaviour. There's a small literature that looks at whether particularly vulnerable groups are selected into particular occupations. So it's not that the occupation presents the risk, it's that those who are selected into that occupation are more vulnerable to suicide. Again, the empirical evidence seems to be very limited around that, but there are some models and some theories and a small number of empirical studies that suggest that there may be this kind of attraction into and recruitment of individuals with particular psychiatric morbidity. The arts and veterinary science, again, seem to be two of those that are kind of theorised for that, if not actually shown empirically in terms of strong data. So then, thinking about kind of a more national level and legal level of attribution of suicide to occupation, in the USA and in France, suicide can actually be classed as work-related. So you actually have this kind of definition of a suicide being work-related under particular conditions, and those include things like the death occurred at work, or it occurred during a work activity, or there was some kind of clear link, like a suicide note that linked work to the death by suicide. In the UK, however, there isn't an official recognition of workplace suicide, and suicides are not reportable under the RIDDOR scheme. And the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council hasn't published on the issue of suicide, and at the moment doesn't plan to do so. However, there was a ruling in the House of Lords in 2008 where an individual who had experienced a workplace accident, and then as a result of that workplace accident experienced depression and then died by suicide, the House of Lords held that the employer was in breach of not taking action to safeguard that employee. Meanwhile, there has been some reporting through the THOR reporting scheme, which is a voluntary scheme where occupational physicians report occupational diseases. There have been some reports of work-related suicide or attempted suicide under that scheme. And then finally, we looked at suicide clusters and also at postvention. So there's quite a substantial literature around how suicides can cluster into groups. Now, this is mostly focused on temporal groups or spatiotemporal groups, and kind of reflects the kind of analogy of these clusters happening by contagion. And there is some evidence that these clusters do occur. They seem to be most common in the younger age group, those below 24 years old, but there have also been some examples of clusters in older adults. Now, it's possible that, given all that we've just said, that some of these occupationally specific risk factors might coalesce and be concentrated in a particular organisation or a particular workplace. But that's quite problematic to identify, and at the moment there isn't much evidence on that. And we quote in the paper the example of police in Scotland, but really that was not identified by the employer, it was identified through media reports. And then finally, thinking about if, as an employer, a member of your workforce has died by suicide, how do you make sure that the impact of that on colleagues is minimised? And there are a couple of post-vention or several post-vention frameworks that have now come out, for example, from the Society of Occupational Medicine and from Business in the Community, that aim to help employers take action once a suicide has occurred. But also, as we say in our report, there is a duty on employers to be assessing psychosocial risks. And if there is a death by suicide in a particular workplace or organisation, that really should prompt a reflection on and a risk assessment of whether there was a psychosocial element to that, and minimise further risks to other employees. And of course, going back to the access to means point, it may be important as an employer to really think about how you remove access to means, particularly in the wake of a death by suicide in your particular organisation. So that was a bit of a quick trot through the data. Hopefully it gives you a feel, and there's more in the report itself. I'm going to hand back to Paul now for the conclusions. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Emma. So pulling it together, what conclusions did we come to? Well, the first one is that there is strong evidence of a variation in suicide between occupations. But as we've said, the determinants, they're complex, they encompass a range of societal, cultural and individual factors, and that those factors probably change over time. When we look at the highest absolute and relative risks, then it primarily falls into low skilled and some skilled occupations. And the likely correlations, as Emma has said there, are things like precarious employment, being unemployed periodically, having a predominantly male workforce, a workforce where there's a high incidence of workplace accidents, a lack of consistent support, and high rates of alcohol and drug misuse. And of course, there can be a lot of crossover between those different factors. And when we look at proportional mortality rates, then they are high in other occupations. So particularly, as Emma has said, veterinary practice, farming, dentistry, hospitality, and work in arts and some cultural industries. And here it does seem that access to means is likely to be an important factor, but also possibly some self-selection of vulnerable people into those trades. So we can move on. In looking at the direct role of psychosocial work stressors in suicide risks, then the evidence is currently quite limited. It's a bit inconsistent too, but the one that comes out most strongly is lack of job control. Emma has spoken about the spatiotemporal clusters that you see generally in suicide, but there's really been no systematic study of this in the context of individual workplaces or employers. There's anecdotal evidence in this country, as Emma said, in relation to Police Scotland. If one looks outside this country, in things like the Foxconn episode in China and the France Telecom Orange episode in France, but really nothing that one would be happy with as robust evidence. And so it would be useful to have future research, further research, that probably needs to be across multiple organisations because of the numbers involved in any single organisation. Given the employer's responsibility to assess and manage both psychosocial risks and prevent harm, then any apparent suicide should prompt additional risk assessment and think about minimizing access to means along with postvention. Now, that can be difficult because you don't necessarily know that someone has taken their own life, but you often have a strong suspicion that is the case, even if it's not absolutely clear. And so those are sensible actions for any employer to take. So we move on, Emma. Some jurisdictions, but not ours, do formally recognise a category of work-related suicide, and that's certainly something to consider. At the moment, there are no systematic ways of collating data on employee suicides within an organisation or a workplace, so it could well be beneficial to establish a way of recording more data, and possibly by an extension of the voluntary THOR reporting system. Statutory reporting is difficult because registering a suicide can be really delayed quite significantly because of a requirement for a coroner's inquest in England and Wales. In Scotland, the system is rather different with sheriffs. So we have suggested that it might be useful for HSE to consult with coroners on additional data recording options. There is already a memorandum of understanding on preventing future excess that exists between HSE and coroners in England and Wales. And again, we suggest that if built upon, that could provide a basis for reliable data when, in the coroner's view, work has been material to a suicide. So those were our conclusions. Now, as ever, when you write anything, it's out of date by the time the ink hits the paper. So if we can flip to the next slide, please, Emma. So we just pulled out a few references that you might find of use in terms of things that have come out this year and therefore post-date the review that we published. The first is the report of the all-party parliamentary group on issues affecting men and boys, and they looked specifically at suicide in men and boys. Unsurprisingly, they recommend that because it is predominantly an issue relating to the male gender, that things should be looked at through a male lens. They also state that things have perhaps become over-medicalised, that suicide is often seen as a consequence of mental ill health, and that it's useful to go upstream from that and to look at some of the drivers that we've been talking about this afternoon. The next two references are from the same edition of the Scandinavian Journal for Work and Environmental Health, published in September. The first one is a Danish study, quite a large study, that looked specifically at bullying and suicide and is helpful in terms of strengthening the evidence base around that as a factor. And they showed that workplace bullying did appear to have a significant association with subsequent risk of suicide. The second one is from Sweden, and that looked at psychosocial job stressors. And as Emma has said, the main thing to come out of that was lack of job control being the main significant factor. And that finding of lack of job control has been strengthened even further by the final reference there, which appeared in Occupational Environmental Medicine just last month, again a study from Sweden, which showed that job control or lack of job control was a significant factor in the suicides that they studied. So that is that from us.